Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Well, we're back for more Live from the Heartland. This is the show for the 15th of July. It is number 160 since the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm really honored to bring on one of America's greatest historians, the one, the only Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. Good afternoon to you, Roxanne.
Good afternoon, Michael. Good to be with you again.
It's good to have you. I know we've been chasing this for a while, and I know you're feeling a little bit better. I got to look at a lot of stuff that you've written or read about them. I confess the only book I think I read was Growing Up Okie or Red Dirt, Oklahoma, which is, Oklahoma has always fascinated me. So I think maybe while I've got you on this Zoom for Live from the Heartland, we could talk a little bit about your books in general, do a little bit of stuff about Oklahoma. We'll talk some immigration, some indigenous rights and people's movements, etc. I think we'll have a good time, and everyone who's either listening or watching, depending on how you get the show, you're going to have a good time. So with all that said, how are you doing?
Yeah, well, I'm doing fine. Yeah, let's start with Oklahoma. I am a historian, I have a doctorate in history from UCLA, and I wrote my dissertation on the history of land tenure in New Mexico. And I was doing Latin American history. So that used to be, a Spanish colony. And so most of the book is about the Spanish period. I add on the US period. But then I got recruited by, it was a year after the American Indian movement of Wounded Knee. And so the trials of all the leaders had taken place, and I sort of followed it. I was, I didn't have a television, so I followed it a little bit, but I wasn't in any way involved. And then I got recruited I actually was in touch with a lawyer who had been Angela Davis's lawyer and was also working with the Wounded Knee, the legal defense, John Thorne, a white, fantastic leftist lawyer in San Jose, California. And I knew John from way back. I can't even remember when we met, but he was a friend, and he called me up and he said, would you be willing to be an expert witness in the Wounded Knee trials? It's actually not a trial, but an attempt to put all the cases together and dismiss them. So it was just a judge, not a jury or anything. And I said, well, what would I have to say? I don't know anything about it. And he said, well, you wrote this wonderful book, on New Mexico and the conquest of the Pueblo Indians and the Navajos. And I said, well, what does that have to do with South Dakota and AIM? I was kind of clueless, honestly. And he said, I want to, he put Vine Deloria on the phone, and I knew he was a famous author. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was a famous author. He said, I'm sure you, from what John tells me, you're a fast learner. And so they sent me this box of documents to read and to prepare to be an expert witness. So anyway, that led to me going into, actually being on the team, not just giving expert testimony, but helping organize it and everything. Because I'm an older organizer, someone tells me, could you do this? Oh, yes, well, I'll do this. And I get a crew together and we do it. You know how, it's 60 people. We're great organizers. And so then I kind of got drafted into being an organizer for Native rights, and changed my whole field from Latin American history to helping set up ethnic studies programs and Native American studies, and ended up at Cal State Hayward. So that's my, my academic career and movement, before and after I got a PhD, sort of put together. And I started, I wrote that was my first book, my dissertation. I published it, but then I published the hearings at that Wounded Knee thing, and was in Nebraska in federal court, and published that as The Great Sioux Nation, and all of the money from it. It sold very well. Books used to sell very well, and it all went to the International Indian Treaty Council. So then I got involved, kind of drafted in being involved in the UN work. And this is how I got then a decade or two decades really of helping build a Indigenous caucus in the United Nations, which is now just huge. It's like just, it's the biggest mass non-governmental organization meeting in the UN system every year. And so I'm retired. I retired from doing that myself about 10 years ago. But so that was a very exciting time. But I didn't get much time to write during that time. I did one book in 1983, and I thought I have just got to get back to writing. Because I was writing a lot, but it was mostly, well, let's be frank, propaganda. I mean, it wasn't analysis so much as UN reports and articles and stuff. And I want to get back to being a historian. So but then I decided I had to really learn to write in a different way than I was trained, as a historian, just, facts and indexes and footnotes and highly researched. I knew how to do that, and I wanted to continue doing that. But I want to write in because I had written a lot, and I actually had wanted to be an English major and a writer and turned to history. So I started doing writing groups and all that to lead up to why did I write an autobiography about growing up in Oklahoma. That's how I got there, because that's what I tackled, with I spent a lot of time in Nicaragua in the 1980s, exposing the Contra War and reporting to the UN. So I wanted to write about that. And I knew I could tell the history, but I wanted it to be in a form that would be more journalistic or literary. So I joined a bunch of writing groups. I went to a month-long writing workshop at Bennington, and I did. I learned to write in this literary way, and so then I wrote Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie. I kept, when I was trying to write about Nicaragua, I kept wanting to tell the backstory of me and how I got there. And I finally just gave over to it and wrote about the first 20 years of my life in Oklahoma. And
I loved the Oklahoma book, and I always had a kind of infatuation with Oklahoma, thinking it was kind of a cool place, and I'm always curious about Oklahoma because, I think you talk about it in your book, that first book on Oklahoma. You talked about the Green Corn Rebellion, which was in 1917 against conscription, and it was Native Americans, Muskogee Creek, and then European Americans, farmers, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. So for me, it was always, and I remember telling this to Cornell West when I introduced him, at the Heartland
Uh-huh.
Cafe, and he loved it because he's from Oklahoma. And
Yeah, he's from
I'm always
Tulsa.
a little puzzled about Oklahoma because there's a lot of Native Americans there, and there's a lot of African Americans there, and yet it has, after the early days when we had the Green Corn Rebellion, your father was a socialist and an atheist. Um, you know, I think it was even before oil. It just people in the green corn got wiped out, and
Yeah.
it's been very right wing. I know in the news just now, the last three remaining people from the massacre in 1921 in Tulsa, the judge threw it out, wouldn't proceed.
I know.
Uh, and I just, I'm always so sorry that Oklahoma, even though it has lots of marijuana now, is such a right wing place. And I don't know if there's that much hope for it. Um,
Yeah.
Roxanne, you did mention Nicaragua. That I didn't know, but you had a book out, I think, on what's the group? Mosquito Indians on the East Coast.
Yes, it's called Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War. All of the revolutionaries, the Sandino revolutionaries fled. And so San Francisco, the whole Latino population was Nicaraguan and some Salvadorans. So they all went down to fight in the revolution. And they were leaders of our movements here. And suddenly there's this gap. You could really tell at the same time the Iranians, who were also militant, they went to the Iran. I mean, we look around, where's our movements? Where are our demonstrations? They've gone to fight at home.
I don't know where Nicaragua is at today. I mean, you talk about San Francisco. And when I went to Nicaragua the first time, Berto Vargas was our contact, and he talked to me about when they would be practicing up in the hills outside of San Francisco.
I know
the revolution.
Absolutely, and we were friends, back then, and I knew them because I was at San Francisco State, and there were a lot of Nicaraguans there, and so yeah, the movement was really strong here, and then they all went back home, and of course that Roberto organized a trip for us to take a trade unionist. He had worked with trade unionists. He was an organizer for trade unionists, organized with the United Farm Workers and then other, trade unions. And the trade union movement was really getting organized. And I mean, it was a part of the revolution, that brought the Sandinistas to power. It's lesser known, but he organized several of us who were in unions. And of course, I was active in my teachers union at Cal State Hayward. And so he invited me and several others, from the telephone company and from the longshoremen, 3 longshoremen, black longshoremen. It was a wonderful delegation. I mean, everyone was so impressed because some of the delegations going down were pretty lightweight. I mean, it was like, okay.
We were playing baseball.
Yeah, but we were, yeah, all the workers, we went into, there weren't that many factories, and, it's an agricultural country, but every factory that did exist, we visited it. And of course, the longshoremen at the the piers on both sides, on the Gulf and on the Pacific, we met. So it was just a really, it wasn't a high up, we didn't meet Daniel Ortega or really anyone. We were just traveling around Western Nicaragua. And then Roberto asked me to stay instead of going back, so he could arrange for me to go out to the eastern part of the country and just give my opinion of what was going on, because we knew that the CIA was organizing to overthrow the Sandinistas, of course. That was known when they overthrew Grenada, that was like the rehearsal, in 1980. Three? Yeah. And so I said, yes, I could do that. Well, I had no idea what I was getting into, even in Oklahoma with all, I never saw a paved road growing up. I grew up rural, but this was beyond rural. This was desolation. It was really the only instrument for the farmers was a machete. No tractors, nothing. So I felt quite at home in some ways. I mean, I felt at ease with these people. The farmers are kind of have something in common around the world. Not big wheat farmers, but real farmers that put their hands in the dirt. And so we went, and it was already they had decided to organize. They had a plan. I found out from Phil Agee and some of these other CIA guys who had turned against the CIA, how they planned things. And they were using the Hmong plan, how they recruited the Hmongs to be a force to fight the Vietnamese. They trained these mosquitoes. They chose the mosquitoes as the Hmong, the Hmong blueprint. And so I didn't know that, I didn't know that when I went there. But I started seeing things that, were clearly what I did know about the CIA, and I was certainly no expert on the CIA. I had read James Agee's book, his memoir, and knew, kind of what their practices were. And they were training in camps. So I started, I spent 6 weeks out there. He kind of dropped me there and left me, and then there's no way to get back.
We have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to switch gears here because there's two things that I've heard you talking about, and I know you've written about. And first would be, I know this is a lot to cram in, but kind of the mythology of us being an immigrant nation and how we have viewed immigration. A little bit about settler colonialism.
Yeah.
And the myth of the nation of immigrants.
Yeah, that's my 2021 book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, on settler colonialism. Yeah, that's something that really bothered me for a long time, that slogan, which when I started researching it, I didn't really know the source of it. I just thought maybe that's what was always said, back from the beginning. But no, it was John F. Kennedy wrote a book called A Nation of Immigrants. And this is a bestseller. I don't know why I didn't remember it, because I loved John F. Kennedy. It was for a while. For a while, yeah. But back in the day, I don't know why I didn't read that little book, but I didn't. So I had no idea that it was him. And then it took on, it got promoted as kind of the slogan for the United States, that it's a nation of immigrants. And because I had already done a lot of work on settler colonialism, and it was very clear the United States was a settler colonial country. And, all you have to do is be in any kind of relationship, as I was, with the Sioux trials and all the Wounded Knee trials, to know that settler colonialism was, the United States created the blueprint for that. And so that, that was, that book was really interesting to research because there's so much I didn't know. I love it. Historians, I think, love this when they set out to write something and they think they're the expert, and then they discover you keep finding these jewels, these things, and you learn from yourself. It's the most exciting thing about being a historian. People think, well, you knew all that all the time. No, I learned it while writing this book, that it was just so interesting. And so that nation of immigrants is a kind of cover up for settler colonialism and genocide. It's why Native American history wasn't taught for years and still isn't extensively taught, only in liberal urban centers, I would say, and probably in the South, there's very little. And back east, they just think, well, they never had any Indians there anyway. So it was all a Western story, it didn't start at the Atlantic Ocean and go to the West, but after, a genocide, ethnic cleansing. So yeah, by that time, there were a couple of really, really good books that had come out on settler colonialism in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Anglo settler colonialism. And it really started in Ireland, with the British settler colonialism of what Northern Ireland is today. So it was just such an interesting book to write because tracing it back and then having a whole chapter on Ireland and a whole chapter, well, beginning with Spain, that was in places they had settler colonialism, like New Mexico and later Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay. So, yeah, it's really important to understand. This means that people who settled consider themselves indigenous, because they actually, the army goes in and does the killing mostly, but then it's free land, to take. So they see themselves as indigenous to the land. And it's such a screwed up thing, that's how you have the right-wing Republican Party today. There's always been that strand, but it's been more isolated. It used to just be the norm,
Yeah, we have this, this myth of a nation of people from all over, and we're all coming together and making a beautiful thing. And I definitely grew up with that kind of melting pot notion and believed it.
I do too.
I've just been reading a book by a woman named Kelly Little Hernandez called Bad Mexicans.
Yes.
About the Mogonistas on the border, building up to the Mexican Revolution. And she talks about in this book, and I bring this up because there's so much resistance to immigrants throughout our whole history, and it currently is going on now. She talked about 1915, El Plan de San Diego. And it was basically Mexicans on the border finally being tired of being lynched and beaten up and robbed, and they fought back, and a few people were killed, and that resulted in a thing called the Matanza, with the massacre, and they killed like at least 300 Mexicans. And this is not, I think this will come out more as Latinos become, more ingrained in the society, and the history of the repression is shared. But all of this kind of leads to this whole underlying thing that we knew was there, kind of a fascist underbelly. And you talk a lot about, and you said you're working on white supremacy. And let's talk a little bit about the plague of white supremacy at a time when we are about to have more than 50% of the people in this country be non-white.
Yeah.
So what's happening?
And in a couple of decades, the demography will reduce the Anglo-white population. They include Germans and Scandinavians and all that,
I can't wait.
They'll be reduced in numbers. And so I think, the rise of white supremacy, again, it was, white supremacy was just the rule up to the 1953 Board of Education decision to integrate schools. Until then, there was, everything was locked down, and Black people started fleeing the South, in the turn of the century to get out of there and go north. But there they faced segregation too. And here in California, they face segregation. here, and we're doing a reparations thing here in San Francisco right now for the segregation and oppression. So, but it was all locked down, and here suddenly there's this. They're going to integrate schools, so it really starts in the South. Actually, Missouri, the White Citizens Council forms. The John Birch Society. I'm writing a book now, a book of essays on white nationalism. So I did the chapter on that, especially on the John Birch Society and how insidious they were. They still exist, but actually, it's just the Republican Party now.
I realized John Birch was a big thing. I remember in the early 60s, it was, I was real aware of it. And there were I went to Lake Forest College, and there were some conservative Republicans there. And that's when I first learned about the John Birch Society. But what do you think the chances are of a white supremacy actually conquering the rest of us? Or do you think that this will fade out over time?
Well, I think the Democratic Party they're kind of in denial about the seriousness of this. And myself, coming from rural Oklahoma, some of these people are my relatives. I mean, I don't feel like it is something that will just disappear. That just because they're a minority doesn't. It's always minorities that have started revolutions. This is a counter revolution, but it's scary. I mean, it was hoisted to power, presidential power, with what's his name, Donald Trump.
You don't have to use his name. We know who you're talking about.
And it's terrifying. And they seem just like everyone is rational. Let's just be rational here, and win elections. And why aren't we winning elections when we're the majority? Because they've taken power in the states, in the counties. They started out the John Birch Society back in 1956, Orange County. That's the only place they were, a tiny group, And now it's the whole Republican Party. And you could see it with Nixon. You could see it with, he was a California boy and came out of Orange County. So it's not like it's just popped up now. It's a whole process, but they're in such denial that I'm really scared that just not enough is being done to expose them. They're not the Republican Party is no longer a really legitimate party. It's gerrymandered. They seem to be smarter about power than Democrats.
And a lot of money to put into things too.
But Democrats have always depended on the vote, but and that's fine. But when you have district representation and you've taken over districts and gerrymandering them, they can always find a way to win. And so that it's a very scary time, I think, that we are really just because they're a minority, but they do have a hardcore base of 20 million people. Now, what if we on the left had a total Marxian 20 million people in the United States? Imagine what we could do.
Yeah,
that's
great.
That's what they're doing.
I got two more questions I want to try to get in. One would be, you did a book on guns. I think on the Second Amendment.
Yes.
What I got it here is Loaded: A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. And I know that I heard you talk about how right-wing groups have basically taken over the NRA. So could you give us, our viewers and listeners, a few minutes on guns and the Second Amendment and the status of the NRA?
Yeah, the NRA is interesting. It was formed in the 1880s by former Union soldiers to teach marksmanship. because that had become a sport in the Olympics, and to send, just use BB guns, for marksmanship, blanks. It's not really gunslinging kind of sport. So that it stayed pretty benign. In the 1930s, there was the first gun law was passed. There were local gun laws, and most of them were restrictive. Leave your guns at the door, at the door in the saloon. Or take them in with you.
I've seen those signs back in the day. Now I see signs that say no guns at all, but I remember in Montana, leave your gun at the door.
Right, exactly. So that the NRA was pretty much, when they testified before Congress about the outlawing the what used to be called the Tommy gun, the first kind of militaristic repeating rifle, they supported it. They said, would this go against NRA? The question, they said, no, we support it. So that's the only gun law, and they supported it. So when it changed was after Vietnam. It's a very important time, 1975. The bitterness of the soldiers, the beginning of what they call it, that movement of veterans, about the bodies left in Vietnam.
In action, MIA.
Yeah. And this, in the beginning of, kind of armed groups and all. And so 75 was a really, I can remember it, a really fraught time, that there were just things kind of popping up that were so right wing. The NRA got taken over by a Harlan Carter, who had been a border guard, border chief. He was in charge of the expulsion of millions of Mexicans in the 1950s. And he went on to he had grown up in El Paso and, on the border, and basically his dad was a border guard. He was a border guard. And then he retired from that, and he moved up to Washington State in the East, where there's always been a kind of right-wing thing there. There's a white, the white America. They want to have, a white part of that would separate from the United States. So they had this little separatist group, and he went there and really got them organized. And then that group infiltrated the NRA and took over in 1975. White nationalists took over the NRA in 1975. White nationalists are in charge of it. It doesn't mean the membership, people don't know. The people who join, who are like hunters or whatever, and they want to be in an organization, it's not very expensive. They don't really have to do anything. They don't even have to go online and look at the crazy videos they have there. So 5,000 members, that most of them are benign, so that they took over. They have become more and more white nationalists. And so the NRA is really a organized fascist, fascist organization with a good percentage, probably about 10% of really hardcore fascists, white nationalists.
Roxanne, let me ask you, as we close out, I mean, we could talk for a long time, but you and I have both been in the movement for a long time. And I would like to ask you if you could share any thoughts you might have on advice to younger and newer activists about things to do and how to keep your sanity going forward.
Yeah, I was thinking of this, how we back then we had, you know, SDS, it's like shirts and ties, and women in skirts and very straight. And then the hippies came along and kind of culturally radicalized. And so and then the Vietnam War, you know, the buildup of the Vietnam War. So all this kind of merged into huge protest movements. It's hard to remember now how big they were, you know, and up until I remember the last really big one I know about was the 1983, the anti-nuke rally in New York that went, you know, the marchers started at the bottom of Manhattan, and by the time those of us in mid Manhattan got, you know, got in, they were already gone. And by the time we got to the park, where there was then a rally, they were halfway through the rally. You know, I mean, it was huge numbers, millions of people, and that was against, you know, for nuclear disarmament. So I think our movements, that was kind of the end. You know, it seemed like, oh, it's revived because we had all these, you know, massive demonstrations. But when the Vietnam War ended, there really was, you know, we had the women's movement, we had marches, you know, women's marches, but nothing that, you know, would be that really attract young people, you know. And then the Reagan administration, it just put a pall on things, you know. It really hurts my head to even remember the Reagan era, because that was when I was the Contra War, and I was so involved, and we lost. You know, I have the feeling that we lost big, and there's this kind of morose. We haven't been able to pull out of that, our generation. So we ignited new generations at first, and they carried on. They were fantastic in Central America in the 1980s. Younger people, they don't even need me anymore. This is fantastic. But then after the crash of really existing socialism, you know, the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, and China had already, you know, kind of made its peace with Nixon, and then we really haven't been able to revive, you know, even the Iraq War, that one huge demonstration. And then I remember young people, and that was mostly really young people, our grandchildren, and they had this, you know, when it didn't stop the war, you know, the war went ahead. They thought, well, demonstrations don't do any good, you know, we lost. So we don't see that kind of we had in 2011, you know, the rather strange camping in the town square.
We did have, after when Trump was elected, I remember there were the women's marches all over the country.
Yeah, well, women's marches, yeah. But, you know, these, I think that's been so specific that there really weren't women against war marches, which we had in the 60s and 70s, you know, the fantastic women's for peace, and so we haven't combined these things. They're more specific marches, and we've had the teachers, you know, and remember, I mean, it's almost forgotten, these teacher strikes all over the country a few years ago, you know?
Yeah, we've had a bunch of them in Chicago. I'm running out of time here, and I'm really honored to have you talk to you, and I'm going to probably hit on you to do it again at some point. I want to really thank you, Roxanne, for coming
Thank you,
on.
Michael.
And you keep writing because what you're doing is really good. And I've sort of given up watching sports every night, and I'm starting to read more again, which is
Good. Yeah,
probably a
sounds
good
like
thing.
it.
So thanks an awful lot, and I'll
Good.
be in touch.
Thank you, Michael. Bye.
Okay.